Welcome to the Funnel Reboot Podcast with your host, Glenn Schmeltzley. Let's get into today's show.
Hey, Glenn here. Welcome back to Funnel Reboot, the show for analytically minded marketers. Let's get straight into today's topic. We're going to talk about senses. Animals have all kinds of senses. Fish and sharks have a great sense of touch and smell. Bats have sonar. Dogs and other large mammals have a great sense of smell. But for humans, our eyes are most important. Some pretty cool facts about the human eye. I didn't realize that our brains are actually extended out into our eyes. Our rods and our cones are actually an outgrowth of the human brain, which takes this visual information and shoots it back into our visual cortex amazingly fast. How fast? Scientists have been able to find people can detect whether a light is flashing more than 24 frames a second, which is what movies are at, more than 35 times per second. Some can do it 60 to 75 times per second. That's down to about 13 to 15 milliseconds. As a comparison, the time it takes you to blink is about 100 milliseconds. Not only that, but we can tell what we're seeing. Babies that are as young as 2 months old can tell the face of their parent from across the room. And we have something called pre-attentive processing, where we can unconsciously notice things about what we're getting through visual stimulus before we are truly even consciously looking at it. So seeing is believing. We use vision to form a mental model of the world around us all the time. And it's important in business too. Almost every time people meet, some visual tool is there to guide the discussion. This practically essential object has become a presentation, specifically a data presentation. But knowing what we know about the visual sense, creating something that's tuned for people's minds as well as their hearts, takes combining the fields of neuroscience, storytelling, emotion, persuasion, design, and effective communication. That's a lot to know, but our guest can help you do it. For over a decade, she's helped those in the digital marketing and web analytics communities transform their presentations from snoozefests into experiences that inspire action. She's a workshop leader and a keynote speaker. And we're going to talk today about the book that she came out with in 2024 called Present Beyond Measure. So let's now go south of New York City to the Jersey Shore to talk with Lea Pica. Lea Pica, welcome to Funnel Reboot.
Thank you so much, Glenn. It's great to be here.
I'm so glad to have you on here. We're going to talk about a book that you have published. What's the name of the book?
It's called Present Beyond Measure, just like the podcast that I've had for about 10 years.
Yes, and the subtitle of the book is Design, Visualize, and Deliver Data Stories that Inspire Action.
Thank you. I could not remember that.
Please don't make me say that. I was reading it too. Yeah, that's all good. The point about inspiring action, I want to begin there because I, like many of our listeners, have sweated over some number crunching that I've had to do. I've been reviewing a campaign. It's largely around, customer acquisition. How are we acquiring? What are the things that are going well in sales and marketing or not? And I'm trying my very best to not only give that information, because I've tried in the past to just give that information and it's landed with a thud on the boardroom table and there's been nothing that comes of it later. So I've wanted to get farther and I've wanted to hit this mark of inspiring action. Can you tell me a little bit about how central inspiring action is to even the way that we begin this whole process?
Yeah, it's kind of the big carrot on the end of the stick that I would love for data practitioners and presenters to remember is supposed to be at the end of the data communication process. Now, there are a lot of internal reasons, personal to practitioners, to leadership, and also there are cultural aspects to this conversation that are really important. And I try to address all of them at those particular levels, but I mainly attempt to empower practitioners with both practical, strategic, and tactical tools they can use in their presentations, but also some bigger picture questions to ask in terms of the culture of why does the for your information only meeting exist? Or, FYI.
Mm-hmm.
And I also call that fake your insights, because people are trying to make things up that they just bring in day after day or week after week. And, is there a cultural glut of meetings and sharing communication where we're just a bit codependent on the process, and it's much more about staying on top of numbers and less about the actual action that's supposed to be taken as a result of it?
Yeah. So what I hear you say in that is that we have, ever since, I'll name it, the creation of PowerPoint, um, fallen into using it as a crutch. That
Mm,
it was short of us saying, what is the point of this meeting? Or why are we even looking at how, let's say, a campaign did? Um, we just say, well, I'm only going to concern myself with opening up PowerPoint, creating a few slides, showing up at the meeting, firing it up, walking through those slides, and calling it a day.
right.
That's less work, right? Less
Yep.
mental anguish. It's
Mhm.
harder, but more important that we ask, what are the audience's needs? Um,
Yes.
and this is an important point for me, is we we have a hard time getting those needs. Um, we have a hard time inferring them from stakeholders, but we
Mhm.
even also have a hard time getting the stakeholder themselves to rationally describe what those needs are. Why?
Mhm.
Why is that? Why can't they even say, yeah, I want to call this meeting and it's because, and they can't fill that blank in.
So this is sort of the question of the ages, right? In terms of the glut of meetings and why people feel so uninformed, or, that it wasn't a good use of their time. And one of the best books I found some answers in was actually written by my friends Chris and Zach Gemignani of Juice Analytics, and it's called Data Fluency. And I think there's a lot of wisdom contained in just that book title.
Hmm.
Fluency is about speaking a common language. And just like we data practitioners, we often didn't go to data practitioner school
Right.
and learn that visual and verbal communication of data was going to be an integral part of our job. We didn't really learn. Maybe we got trained in things like Google Analytics or Excel, but we didn't learn the principles of visual and verbal communication. So, just like we didn't get equipped with that knowledge, our leadership and our stakeholders did not go to stakeholder school and learn how to become fluent in the language that takes their own needs, their challenges, their aspirations, the things that they want most, the things that are keeping them up at night, and translate that into a kind of directive that we can use to mine our data,
Right.
if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, one of my favorite quotes in the Data Fluency book, I have to paraphrase because it's not in front of me, but it's something to the effect of presenters need to meet where stakeholders, where they are at as a first step, and
Right.
really begin to build a bridge between these numbers that are in the cells and the spreadsheets and the databases and the human language term needs. And sometimes that means, I don't know, picking up this ancient communication device that had this curly string attached to it called a phone, and we pick it up and we actually have a conversation with our stakeholder, and we show them how much we're invested in their success, and we start to get to know them. and the human behind that face during the meeting, that inscrutable face that just looks confused and asks challenging questions,
That's true. And you say later in the book, that inscrutable face, it's not necessarily that they're being mean.
No.
Some people just look that way.
Yeah.
But, there are also times where they are doing their very best because they are themselves, in the moment they're hearing it, viscerally feeling the emotion of
Mm-hmm.
what it's going to give them. And what you're saying is, well, if at all possible, let's back that process up to before the meeting, and let's try to get them even just to peck around the edges and try to give us maybe hints of where they're going. I really liked how you tied it into the recommendations that you're going to end up at the end with, that it might be that you are trying to anticipate a little bit of their needs, and
Mm-hmm.
you're still going to use the rigor of the data, but what you are trying to do is figure out, as a human being, what would somebody decide if they had this data in front of them and they knew exactly what the data meant. They may not, but I do. So what can I do on their behalf to give them that? And the other part of it that I found very helpful was that we have to remember that doesn't mean that we can just dump all the data on them. That's not the purpose of the meeting. In fact, if they fit into, you make a nice quadrant of, saying that some stakeholders are maybe business savvy, but not technically savvy,
Mm-hmm.
or that, they don't have enough business savvy to even know, what you're doing, but they saw how you arrived at the numbers.
Right.
You have to make sure that the way you show your information is tailored for those audiences. So it's a lot of understanding humans, but
Mm-hmm.
if you can speak human and you can think human because you are one, you probably have a leg up on how to do this.
Yeah, I like to say that if you really want to win at this, welcome to your psychology master's degree. Because that is what you're contending with. And you make a really good point, in how our stakeholders might react to our information. Because one of the biggest questions I get from my workshop participants is, but what if it's bad news? What if I have to tell them bad news? And there's so much fear behind that. And, I understand, because when you are scanning an audience and evaluating their reaction, you might see them scrunch up their face and kind of look like, a baby does when he's about to, go. But, they're processing a lot at once. They're processing both what you've shared with them. And if they don't like anything about what you've shared with them, now they're processing a conflict between their hopes and expectations, previous cognitive biases that they're bringing to the table, like, what, that can't be. It has to be this way. It cannot be that way. They're processing maybe grief that some project or something, some test they really cared about or invested a lot in.
Something that reflects about how they do their job.
Right. It didn't pan out. And that's a form of grief, for lack of a better word. Could be resistance. So you're watching a whole, I love to say it's data driven. I really would love to say that, but it's not. It's really an emotional microcosm of activity that is happening in them. And you kind of just have to really stand firm. This is why feeling really confident in your numbers is useful. But it's also really good. There's a section in the early part of the planning part of my book, phase 1, around anticipating objections, where you really put your psychologist hat on and you really try to get ahead, like, they're not going to like this. How can I get ahead of it? And how can I acknowledge that this is going to be challenging, or this is contrary to what people commonly believe? But we firmly believe this and we have a plan, but we also have a backup plan. So you're really like walking people through. You're trying to create another bridge between their hopes and desires and maybe missed expectations, and the reality of things, which it just is, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And you're trying your very best to um, take them along on a journey with you. And this is where story comes in. Um, you talk about how when you can properly, set the theme for how the meeting's going to happen. Like you don't even want to say it is a meeting to review something. You want to describe it as a meeting where a decision is going to happen.
Mm,
And then, you borrowed from TED Talks, the idea of the whole part of getting into the meeting and then talking about the meeting and then actually going through the substance of the meeting.
mhm.
There's a through line that traces all the way through it.
Yes.
Can you take us, how we're going to follow all that in order for that final set of decision or recommendation can actually be presented?
Yeah. So the through line is by far one of the most loved tool sets and part of my process that I give my readers and clients because it kind of gives them the breadcrumb trail out of the dark forest that practitioners are trapped in and that we trap our audience in as well. So it's more than thinking about what the meeting is. It's more about capturing a story, an overarching theme or story of what has happened, and you're presenting it at the meeting. These are two different ways of looking at it, if that makes sense. Like
Mm-hmm.
one of my participants actually once got a meeting invite called Data Meeting.
Yeah.
That was the name. And we're sort of just naming a process of what something is instead of actually, like, if you think about how I'm always thinking about what Hollywood would do in contrast. Like if we did if Hollywood did what we do in our meetings, what would happen to Hollywood? I actually have an entire keynote dedicated to that question. It's hilarious because, you think if someone was putting on Game of Thrones to watch, would they see an executive summary slide with the title of "This is a data meeting"? like
Yeah.
this is a show about dragons and people killing each other? No, we're not describing just what the thing is. There has to be some kind of storyline that we are hinting at. And if we make it a single sentence, maybe two, we are actually greatly filtering down a lot of the extraneous noise that we tend to pack in our meetings because we think that we just have to bring every number with
Yeah.
us. And we get asked to bring every number generally because stakeholders aren't confident they're going to see a cohesive storyline come from the presentation. So when I started presenting less, but more focused, cohesive narratives, people stopped asking me for all the numbers. They felt confident they'd walk away with something useful and something actionable. So the through line, I think of it as a movie trailer for your presentation. So
Right.
when you go see a movie trailer, you're kind of seeing a lot of stage being set. You're seeing what the topic is about. Who are the characters? Is this a new story? Is this an old story? With an old character with a new story? You're starting to hear the music. You see the time period. You get the whole stage set. And then you start to see that something is happening. There's some kind of event, some kind of conflict happening. So you kind of get a sense of what the movie's about. And then you hint that there's like big battles
Right.
and, you know, big striving for overcoming the conflict, overcoming hardship. But you have no idea the full details of who the characters are, what they are going through, or how they overcame or even did they overcome. You're just seeing enough hints to create a lot of intrigue and anticipation, but you do have some clarity about what this is about. And that's what the through line is designed to do in one sentence. And every single TED Talk has to have one in order to go up on stage, or else it's not allowed up there.
I think you've beautifully put how you can construct it so that you are going to give them a sense of what is going to be explained what was found out in the process of discovering, what the data contained. But most importantly, and I think this is why we need to use words like we or you, which I heard you saying there. You didn't say they, you said you, meaning you, the business decision maker, what we think you might be able to do about it.
Hmm.
That is the action at the end. And, it's kind of like they become that character in the movie.
Yes.
And when it comes time for that climactic scene, they're the ones who vanquish the enemy. They're the ones who come out on top. They're the ones who make that all important decision that wins the day.
This is exactly right. So that's what the movie trailer does. It just gives
Yeah.
you a sense of the journey enough to whet the appetite and get people to show up and stay engaged. But you're right. The through line for a business presentation is really about previewing to the audience how they are going to become the hero of their own data story.
And that couldn't be farther away than that fear that the workshop person expressed when they said, "What do I do if there's bad news?"
Right.
Like, wow, bad news. This is that's grist
Dun,
for the
dun,
mill.
dun.
Let's right, like cue the hero.
Yeah.
And I even liked how you gave. I'm simplifying immensely here, but the book gives us a box framework for being able to,
Mhm.
put these together. And I've actually started to play with some of the post-it notes and putting things up and
Yeah.
ordering. And as I, put these together, I was able to even see how you can deal with negative results. You talk about we can explain it in terms of loss aversion. And
Mhm.
so, let's say that we were running a marketing campaign and it was going all kinds of wrong and we just shut it off. And this is the meeting where, and I've heard terrible names for it, like a post-mortem,
Yeah.
right? Describing like, okay, here's how it is. And, here we're like
Right.
picturing ourselves standing in the morgue,
Yep.
no, no. What you said instead was look at it as, all right, if we hadn't have paused it, we would have wasted this much budget. But
There you go.
we did. And that means that, that's a signal. The fact that we stepped in and did that because we thought that the stakeholder themselves would probably make that kind of a decision. Now they can, you know, decide otherwise. But if this was important enough that we felt attuned to what they want, and then we wanted to give them a chance to make a change to the status quo,
Mhm.
right? Then the
Right.
meeting actually gets into constructive discussion about what that new thing would look like. Not just, as I said, with a postmortem, that we spend a whole bunch of time poring over something that is now, in the annals of history. I love that.
No, I appreciate that. One of the things I like to point out when I'm speaking is if leaders and executives really want data storytelling, they need to embrace that there was bad news at some point. Because if you do not have a conflict, there is no story.
Hmm.
No conflict, no story. No conflict, no story. Like I just repeat it over and over. I'm like, if you go in there and the story quote is that nothing new has happened, there's no story. Because conflict is central to every story. If you started watching a TV show and you really like the character, but their life is the same episode after episode and nothing changes, the status quo, because of a conflict, you'll stop watching because
Yeah,
humans can't stand utopia. We thrive on conflict.
it's true.
Yes.
Or even if it's things are going well, but we could do better,
But that's a conflict.
right?
So
New worlds to conquer.
the way that I define a conflict is either a problem or an opportunity
Right.
where something is standing in front of you. So, a problem, okay, so our profitability is going down. So I had one I had one of my practitioners I was mentoring at one point. I was having him run through a test and a presentation and he was like, "Okay, guys, here's the bad news." And I was like, "No, no, 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 no." No. So, yeah, that's a great way to kind of shift people's emotional sentiment, in the wrong direction, but it is how you approach it. So a problem, yeah, we are losing profitability. There's a conflict there. However, we have strategized 3 ways we're going to overcome this, and we're going to implement this right away because that's what we do. And then if there's an opportunity, oh, wow, we have an opportunity to claim this. But if we do nothing, we lose the opportunity. So that's how we bring it back in both cases to loss aversion. Humans hate to lose something that we have. So even if we're framing a potential gain, we have to frame it as something we might lose if we do nothing. And that's what the stakes are. That's why they call them stakeholders. And those are the terms that we have to ascribe the story into for them to care about it.
Yeah. Now, while we're spending a lot of time thinking about how their minds work, you help bring to light how my mind works and how those of us who have to make up these presentations, we don't, we aren't naturally able to look at a whole array of data and simply have that story arc, magically appear before us. You say
Mhm.
that it does take us with a pen or a pencil in our hand and with a set of sticky notes where we're trying to just put one idea on each note. And
Mhm.
then we're moving them around and resorting them. And that manual process is what eventually allows, I guess it's our subconscious, to see what the natural cadence of moving through. There were there were initial conditions, but then there was a inciting action, but then we had to look at how that progressed, and then we found ourselves at this place where we now have to decide what to do and either, come out on top or revert to what we did before. That you find we just have to do those. I think you quoted, was it Nancy Duarte, who calls these things slideas, where we're kind of not in between. I mean, I got to point out, I'm catching up on this almost. I'm at like page 77 or 78 of the book, and we haven't even fired up PowerPoint yet. But
Uh-huh.
this is right. We've been spending all this time kind of making sure that we know that we actually have a cohesive presentation on our hands here. Did I catch that right?
Oh, oh yes, Glenn. So there's an entire workshop phase dedicated to planning before there's anything visual. And what I used to do as a practitioner, it's what I learned and it's what I observe most people do, is as soon as you hear about the presentation, maybe you putter around in the data a little bit, develop some charts, and then you fire up PowerPoint or Google Slides and you just start a free-for-all of adding slide after slide and charts and this chart here and that chart here. And oh, they wanted this number and that number. And I call that sort of the kitchen sink
Right.
presentation, where you put everything, including the kitchen sink, in there. So this is what overwhelm is. This is how we are creating overwhelm. And, it's not entirely anyone's fault necessarily. There's a sort of feedback loop happening of, give me all the numbers. I want to see everything, really, because they don't trust they're going to see something they can
Right.
really sink their teeth into. So the practitioner goes and they find everything, but they don't put it in a logical sense or a cohesive narrative. And there's too much. And there's 50 separate slides with lots of ideas on them. And then stakeholders come back and say, can you limit this to just 10 slides? And that's the overwhelm signal. As soon
Yeah.
as people start asking for fewer slides, that's the overwhelm alarm bell. And really putting the planning in place beforehand, not only does it prevent you from wasting a lot of precious time on designing slides that may end up getting cut, and
Yeah.
then you've completely wasted that time. But
It's time consuming.
yeah, exactly. And we love to mess around with that because that's kind of the easier part of all of this. But it's really talking through your slides, making sure that they transition well to each other, that you remember what you're going to say, that you're making notes. this sort of preemptive preparation process is really key to make sure that you have something that people are going to understand and want to take action on.
And that last part you mentioned, that I'd never heard before, which was that I could do a verbal run through before I'd actually made my slides, and that I would get the feedback in my own head of, you know what, that order doesn't sound right, or you know what, why would I go talking on about that? That has nothing to do with the main recommendation that I want to give. So,
Yep.
it's great because I'm like practicing and I'm kind of mentally editing at the same time. And I haven't yet put on all that time where I say, oh, I couldn't cut that. I've sunk so much of my time into that thing. I couldn't possibly just
That's right.
get rid of it. Right now, I've done it before I ever have that problem.
Right, exactly. And I'm not actually suggesting even running through all of it in your head. In this process, you are creating what I call a presentation skeleton, which are very bare bones, design free, conceptual content slides. And you're really mapping them out. You're creating them to match the note taking and brainstorming process that's in the book. And you are talking through those. So you are using your visual aid to talk through, but you're seeing in more of a storyboard stage, just the way, again, Hollywood does not start filming and editing. They start with a storyboard that shows little vignettes, one after the other, of what each angle is going to look like and who's in the frame and what's happening. So, this is a process we can definitely borrow from them that would greatly help us understand the narrative journey we're taking our audience on before we start the filming and editing process, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It just makes so much sense. I do want to get into how you encourage people to actually make slides that people will want to look at. But before we do that, we're going to take a really quick break.
I'll step away to address one thing that's been missing from Funnel Reboot: the ability to access the text of any show. I'm glad to finally announce that the podcast is now fully searchable and copyable thanks to the transcript feature in YouTube. Yes, YouTube. Now, if shows are audio only, they are all on YouTube. Whether you're looking for a specific episode, a topic, or want to search the full text of a show for a specific part, go on to YouTube, head to Funnel Reboot's channel. Okay, now let's get back to the show.
So, Lea, we have taken ourselves, we've got a clear idea of what we are going to actually drop into our slides. And let's say that we've got our charts ready. We've got various tables. Maybe they're not turned into charts yet, but we are right ready to assemble that. You make some points about how we need to maybe fall out of some of the bad practices that we've done. One of the bad ones that I'm guilty of is bullet points. You say that we shouldn't really just drop in bullet points, and make a whole wall of things for people to read. What do you propose that we put it in their place?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I pull the Game of Thrones reference again, like if you were watching Game of Thrones or some show you love now, and you saw an executive summary or slide of everything that's happening, and you saw everything that was going to happen all at once, you'd start reading to yourself and probably becoming disengaged, and you wouldn't be hearing anything or paying any attention to anything else going on. So that's what's happening. Anytime we put run-on sentences, complete sentences on run-on lines into a visual space, it prompts our audience to read to themselves. It's subconscious. And we are basically sharing everything at once. So this is sort of another hack that we've adopted where we just want to make sure we remember what we say, what we want to say, and we read these bullet points verbatim. And then people are reading them to themselves, tuning you out, and simultaneously feeling insanely bored. They're feeling not engaged. And this is what's really happening with that. So you mentioned Slideology, a book by Nancy Duarte.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a book that was really pivotal in my journey. And I learned about this philosophy she has in it called the single idea per slide. And I think I pulled slideas out of that, but the
Okay.
single idea per slide, where instead of putting 10 bullet points of full sentences in a giant block that we show all at once on a slide, what the ideally we are doing is we are making each of those bullet points its own slide, making a sort of succinct, pithy title, observational title for that slide, and then we are visually reinforcing the idea that we're communicating. That's really the most powerful setup for one of your slides. And what that does is if you think of your audience as sort of a cashier at the supermarket. So we're running around the supermarket and we're pulling all of these objects off of the shelves. We're putting all these items, throwing it in the shopping cart. It's all kind of a jumbled mess. And these are our charts and slides and bullets and tables and everything. And we run up to the cashier and we try to push the whole cart through at once. And the cashier's like freaking out because they have to do what? They scan each item one at a time. That's the only way that they can process each item to get it through and ring you up. And that is how your audience's brain functions. It is very difficult to push through simultaneous ideas. That's not how we're wired to take in and process information, much as we like to say, I'm looking for someone who's good at multitasking. Okay, well, good luck.
Right.
That's not how we're wired.
Contradiction in terms.
Yeah. So what the single idea per slide approach does is it allows you to approach the cashier calmly and place everything on a conveyor belt that they are able to pick up and scan and bag one by one so that chaos doesn't ensue. So that's why I give an approach for teasing the ideas out, getting them out of a block format, and really getting more visual. Now, the thing is, I also recognize that this is one of the most difficult habits to break. It's very, very deeply entrenched in our culture. There's also situations where we may want to show a list of things that are related to one idea or show a process step by step, or maybe we want to recap our insights and recommendations at the end of the presentation. So I give a solution for if you can't tease apart all of your bullets and make them all visual, I give a solution I call the story points method that allows you to reveal a series of very succinct phrases that allow you to walk through each idea one at a time so that a series of sub ideas can build up to a master idea, a main idea on each slide.
Please walk us through
it. Sure. So it just takes a little bit of creativity and getting to know your animation pain, which I highly recommend going on a few dates with that if you haven't already, because animation, when it is simple and intentional, is a very powerful tool for storytelling in business presentations. So basically what you're doing is, let's say you have a list of items that all lead up to one idea, but you're breaking down a few items. So you animate a text box with a series of lines. These are succinct phrases, not long run-on sentences, but succinct phrases that allow you to speak what it says, and then you verbally build on that so that their attention comes back to you. And then you animate in each idea one at a time. So it's the only thing that they see. They cannot see the rest of your ideas because they will read them, they will skip ahead, and they will stop listening to you. That is what their brain is doing. So by animating in each idea one at a time, you are still kind of creating a single idea per slide, like per action or refresh. You're getting to address that idea on the spot. And only when you're ready to proceed to the next sub-idea, you animate in the next line, the next phrase, and you dim the prior bullet point or the story point. You dim the prior phrase, which allows us to see, okay, we've already covered that, and that's kind of it's behind us now. It's in the past.
Yeah.
And now that visually pushes their attention down to the next line and allows you to address the next idea. It's so powerful and it's so simple. It just takes really practicing a little bit, but you can create templates that have this functionality built in. It's really only available in PowerPoint at this time. I would love if Google Slides would add that in at some point, but it really is just about getting to know that, but it's understanding this principle that our brains are designed to only consume and crunch one idea at a time.
One of the things that I think it also serves to do, because of the way that you format it, so I'm going by memory, but something like, we wanted to achieve this, but as we did it, we found out that. And so now we find ourselves at a point where we need to do this so that we can have another outcome. And when you're doing it, as you say, in that straight shot, you are keeping them focused. But I think you're also able to use some of the things in the tools to help give a little bit more when it's needed. So, for example, I'm fearful as I'm going through that there might be a parenthetical thought that I want to throw in if I'm seeing a certain reaction, or if something was discussed earlier in the meeting and I know that I have something to talk about that, I want to have that. And you point out quite rightly that within any of these presentation packages, we have a notes section, and we can put that in and it's shown only to the speaker. So we can keep that kind of stuff, that exposition that may be needed, but probably won't be needed to be shown on the screen. It might just need to be mentioned, or right. But the impact of just showing them what they really need to focus on the actual slide, that's what you're getting at, is let's make design, like you called good design, invisible, right? So we have to kind of pare away all the things that could clutter it and just show the things that will get us through to, basically, you say later in the book, when you have done it properly, what it's saying to that stakeholder in the audience is, I get you.
Yes.
So there's a lot there. And in the part of the book that I just can't do justice to, that talks about that animation and text design and chart design, chart types, prominence, how to allocate space, you offer just, I understood why the book had to be in full color, because that's where you use many examples using what color illustrations can give you to show the good and the bad. So we can't really, take a whole lot of time to do that. But coming back to that part about I get you, and when we've executed on those, we are able to get out most of the things that are needed for having an impact. But we're not quite done, because I think there's a few things you rightly point out that we must pay attention to as well in our fervor of trying to get across to this stakeholder and to get them to do this. And I'm speaking directly to people like me who've had a bit of sales in their background. It can be very tempting to then take some data that you have and cross over that line from persuasion into deception. Right. So you call out, the famous one about if people are showing bars on a chart that, the bars are going up, but if you cut off the y-axis, right, and you don't show how much a change is in actual, all the way down to zero terms, you instead kind of dramatize the points, that's actually deceiving, and that we really cannot do that. That's not being it's not truly caring for your audience. Instead, what it's doing is it's taking the explanation of the data and contorting it for what you want, and maybe not what they want. So are there any other things like that you want us to watch for as we try to be ethical in the way we present?
So you're looking for kind of things to look out for in terms of being an ethical data communicator.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so it kind of comes back to what you said. If you find yourself tempted to manipulate the view of data, like truncating the x-axis of a bar chart,
Mm.
to amplify the differences between the bars, um, zooming in on a particular timeline of a line graph to exclude another part of the timeline that
Yep.
would contradict the story that you want to tell.
Yep.
So these are the kinds of things when we begin to manipulate the view of data, or abridge or redact, maybe that's the word, to redact certain elements of
Yeah.
data, leave certain category members out, things like that. You have to ask yourself, why am I doing this? If the answer is, I'm doing this because if I show the whole truth, the story is going to get me in trouble, or it's going to contradict what my boss told me to show, this starts to cross into ethics. And basically, we don't want to go to data jail. That's my number one. That is my number one goal. It doesn't mean that we can't zoom in on certain areas of charts that we want to amplify. So, for example, it's a pretty hard and fast rule not to truncate the bar chart. So, we need the
Yep.
full length of the bar to really accurately compare the length to each other, because that is the value of the bar. And then we're just not seeing something real. But a line graph is slightly different, because a line graph is more about how we perceive the different angles and slopes
Yep.
between the different data points. So the example that I use there is, if you are measuring a really static number, let's take body temperature, for
Right.
example. So your body temperature is an incredibly non-variable metric, and it has a very narrow range of movement, because what happens if you go just a couple of degrees too high or too low?
Yeah, you're hurting in all kinds of ways.
Or you're dead.
Yep.
Death is not far from just a little, there's a small range there. So if you actually show a body temperature graph and you show it with the full axis, you're going to have the world's most boring graph. You're not actually going to, it's going to look almost like a completely straight line. You're not really going to be able to see anything interesting, So in that particular case, that has a small variable range, but a small change can result in a really big impact. So eBay probably has charts and metrics that have like numbers at huge scales
Yes.
that maybe a lot of companies can't conceive of, or Amazon. Let's even talk about Amazon. So some of those metrics are going to be incredibly static, if you plot them with the full view. But if you zoom in on certain views, you're actually able to see the nuance of things a little bit better, without compromising the story, because the impact of those small changes can be massive.
Yes.
So it's all about the intention. Why would I manipulate this view of data? What is it in service to? Is it in service to creating more, deeper, accurate intuitive understanding of this thing? Or is it about hiding something, ignoring something, shoving something under the rug? Those are the intentions that we just have to be mindful of when we're manipulating data.
For sure. And on that intuitive note, I mean, that is the other reason I think we run afoul of this is it's not that we're not trying to be truthful, but we're looking going, well, it's body temperature. It's so static. And then when it moves, how do I possibly show someone who's not used to looking to this data what that means? Like, is that significant? And you pointed out a solution for that. It's in something like analogies. So
Mm.
you
Mhm.
said when they don't really understand what, a number that's in the millions and when it moves a little bit, what that means,
Mhm.
you can say phrases like, you know how, or it's kind of like, or imagine this. And then you put it into something that's, in like a reference to, I don't know, movement of a human or movement of time, something that we deal with every
Right.
day. And then, that really helped me to see, oh, okay, so there are ways that I can make it intuitive, even if this is really quantitatively heavy and the audience person I'm talking to is a lightweight.
Hmm. Yes, absolutely. So, analogies are one of my favorite storytelling devices because they contain a whole little mini story inside of it, which we love. And they allow us to make a mental connection between something that's theoretical or conceptual, or we don't have the capacity to comprehend the scale of something. And then we get to relate it to something that we can actually tangibly conceive of. So there's kind of two ways we used this analogy. So one is the how, or it's kind of like, those are two of my favorites. So I compared body temperature to some kind of inconceivably large number that a company might be working with. That's
Yep.
an easier way to understand because we are very intimately familiar with our body temperature and its patterns. So that can help make a mental connection. And then if you are working with numbers of inconceivably high or small scale, you can even make it a more of a mini story where you can say, the number of people who visit our store every day could wrap around the earth 3 times. That's
Yes.
something like you can say 400 million people. That's a lot, but it's almost a way of really like sending it home where I know I've done that right when my audience goes, whoa, it's the whoa factor. Then they're like, oh, I'm seeing it. So those are two great ways to really help your audience connect. And analogies are also fantastic for technical, complex concepts that we're working in tech all the time, and we're
Mhm.
trying to help them understand how analysis works or implementation, and they're like, what? And analogies are a great way if you can get creative, whether it's cooking or sports or pickleball, whatever.
Yeah.
If you can find some way to pick out elements of something that most people do understand and relate to, and then relate that to something technical or conceptual, you'll go a long way in keeping them on board with you.
I think one thing you did that helps really take me to the wellhead, so to speak, of where I can get these ideas for how to describe the data in a very understandable way is you said, and this is for marketers especially, it's highly likely that humans and their behavior generated the numbers in your data sets.
Yep.
So there you go. You can just kind of say, well, what this graph is showing, like imagine that most of the people who came to that shopping cart situation, they decided to abandon it. If it
Mhm.
was our soccer mom who was busy and trying to, get out the door to soccer practice and they saw that they were on step 1 of 19 steps,
Mhm.
well, right? So it's very easy for us. And on the other side of it is we have to remember we are presenting information that we know, and we can get kind of lackadaisical about that, but
Mhm.
our audience doesn't know. And so you kind of bring in this element of theatrics. You
Mm.
talk about suspense. And, when I was a kid, I went to magic camp and, it was
How
very
fun.
hokey, believe me. But one of the things that they actually got us to do was to say, okay, there's what you know, and there's what they know. And if you
Mm.
take a little bit of time to draw it out and bring them to now know what you know as well. It was all in how they arrived there that shows whether they give that whoa
Yeah.
or they just give you the slow clap of death. So you make you make the point. We're doing a little bit of a performance here, and I'll also
Mhm.
give a very quick shout out because you mentioned that you give a whole chapter on conditioning your voice. So
Mhm.
these are like I guess these are so obvious, but yet we forget about them when we're in a rush to get our slides all ready. And when we're trying to manage in the back of our mind the thought that there's going to be a senior person who's going to grill us
Mhm.
with, some question, which may not even be right in our deck. Um, and that's the part where I suppose we get that stage fright, and we forget about all these good kind
Yeah.
of theatrics that we should be using. But you said one thing, and I just have to get your comment on it. You
Mm.
said that when we are staring down that person who either raises an objection or puts us on the spot with a question that we don't have anywhere ready, is
Mm.
that we're perfectly entitled not to have an answer ready.
Yes.
Um, are you giving me permission to not have an answer ready, Leah?
Yeah, I am, Glenn. I am bestowing upon you the permission because you're not Chat GPT and you're not
Right,
Siri and you're not Alexa. You're a human being that did their best to be prepared.
right.
And this is where, anticipating objections is a useful exercise because it can kind of give you the best chance of not being caught without that answer. But to crumple under the shame of not knowing every question and every answer, it's one of those really anxiety inducing things, patterns that we bring into the conference room. And if we give ourselves that permission, it changes the entire game for us.
I can tell you I would have saved a couple of shirts in perspiration, having known that earlier. Um, and you even provide a response that we can have so that we're able to, in most cases, uh, give that person what they were looking for as they open their mouth, but also to bring ourselves so that we can actually continue and,
Yeah.
and arrive at the destination in the meeting that we really wanted. What do we say back at that moment
What do we say? Sorry, what do we say
to the
back?
stakeholder who's given
Oh,
us
oh.
that,
What is the
I
thing?
disagree with, or what about this?
Yeah. Well, if they ask a question I don't know the answer to, I say, thank you so much. I acknowledge first. I say, thank you so much for asking that question. That really makes me think. And if I need a minute, I'll ask, like, let me think for a moment. And that's actually a really powerful pause I can loop in. And if I say, unfortunately, I don't have the answer to that at this moment, but after this meeting, I would be happy to follow up with you and I'll send you that answer right away. And it's about how you respond to the fact that you didn't have the answer. That is everything. So it's not that you didn't have it, it's how you respond that you didn't have it. And that's what I would love for practitioners to understand. And this communication, all of this, getting the slides right, preparing enough, being prepared, all of it is a practice. It's a new skill. So, Glenn, was there a time that you didn't know how to ride a bike?
Of course.
Okay. So before you were taught how to ride a bike, because someone taught you, right?
Yep.
Were you bad at riding a bike?
Awful.
No, that's not the right answer.
At first, I was terrible. At first, I skinned my knees.
No,
But then,
no. But that's not what I mean. Before you even tried to ride a bike, were you bad at riding a bike? Or did you just not know how
I
to
just
ride
didn't
it
know.
yet?
That's true. Okay, sorry. My ability had never been applied. So
There you go.
how
You
could
were
I know
never
if I was good or
taught.
bad? Yeah.
You were never taught and you never got to practice and you were never guided. So that's what this is. This book is designed to be the education you may have never gotten for this. I'm here to help guide that learning process, but it means practice. If you want to learn to do something well, you have to practice. That's whether we play piano, ride a bike,
Yep.
whatever sport we love, guitar. We were not good at it at one point. We did not know how to do it. And it's really about just embracing this process of learning.
And where it hopefully leads us to is that we've gotten our stakeholders to become comfortable with doing what they didn't know how to do before. Like you said, they hadn't gone to stakeholder school. So we're trying to actually facilitate them being able to nod their head, walk across a bridge, and say yes to a decision based on the data that you've presented. And we have to appreciate what that takes from them. And that if we do all of this preparation, as you say, that's what we're really achieving. And I love that because I suppose I had it wrong in my head before, thinking that all this was about was me walking from slide 1 to the last slide and then closing my laptop and sitting down.
Never to do it again.
Right?
Until next week.
Right. But this gets us to a totally different place, and actually one that transforms teams and companies.
Yes.
You talk about it in public speaking, it transforms audiences.
Yes.
And it's also something memorable. You brought up in the book many good quotes, but Maya Angelou's, right? People will forget what you told them, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And when you're doing that, as our human brains work, we're emotional creatures that later on use logic to justify our answers. This is what it helps us all to do when we're receiving these talks, is we are actually now bringing ourselves to the point we say, yep, all of me is ready to say it's right and I'm doing it.
Exactly. If we start to see this process as not this sort of ball and chain that we have to show up to, this crucible we have to show up to every day,
right,
but instead a process of transformation, not only for ourselves, but for our audience and our organization and our customers, then we start to enjoy it. And that would be nice.
Lea, if people want to find out more about you or about the book, where can they go?
Absolutely. So the best place to learn more about the book would be leapica, PICA.com/thebook. And it has plenty of links to buy. It actually has a way to sign up to get some free chapters if you just want to take it for a spin. You can also search Present Beyond Measure or Lea Pica on Amazon, and you'll find the book there. I have a podcast of the same name, and I am most frequently on LinkedIn. If you're a listener, I would love for you to connect with me on LinkedIn, and please send a note that you're a listener, and I'd love to say hello. I respond to every person.
I'm going to provide all those links in the show notes so people can get there. You now listening, find out more about how your presentations are working so that you can make them even better.
Thanks for listening. Follow the show on Twitter @FunnelReboot. If you like what you have heard today, please consider leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts.